Hi everyone, my name is Grace Wei, and today I'm excited to present to you the results of my Capstone project, a cost-benefit analysis looking at exploring the economic costs and carbon sequestration potential of private land tree planting projects in Ontario. So diving right in and starting off on a bit of a bigger picture, as I'm sure most of us are quite familiar with, atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations have been rising dramatically over the past few decades. This growing concentration is widely acknowledged to have far-reaching consequences like increased intensity and severity of wildfires, coastal flooding, and the spread of pests and diseases, all of which pose a serious threat to both ecosystems and human well-being. As a result, many countries around the world have made commitments to reduce and mitigate their greenhouse gas emissions. Canada has joined this global effort by committing to achieve net zero by 2050, meaning that the country either emits no greenhouse gas emissions or entirely offsets its emissions through actions like tree planting. So part of this net zero goal involves Natural Resources Canada, or NRCan's 2 billion tree program, which is aiming to plant 2 billion additional trees across the country over a period of 10 years. These trees will then offset emissions by absorbing CO2 into their biomass for long-term storage, while at the same time providing other benefits like habitat restoration and air and water filtration. And this leads into Forest Canada, or FC, previously known as Forest Ontario, which is a non-for-profit organization that has signed an agreement with NRCan to help with the 2 billion tree program. So the organization themselves delivers a program called the 50 million tree program, which offers financial and technical assistance with large-scale private land tree planting projects in Ontario. As part of the program, the cost of a landowner's tree planting project can be subsidized by up to $2.50 per tree, which is assumed to be able to cover a significant portion of total project costs. Under FC's agreement with NRCan, the 2 billion tree program covers 50% of this funding, so $1.25 per tree, while the other 50% is covered by FC's various corporate sponsors and donors. However, there has been a bit of a lack of analysis in terms of tree planting costs from seed collection all the way until the free-to-grow stage. This is the stage where planted trees are thought to no longer require any human intervention. So most of the time, only the cost of buying the tree and putting it into the ground is considered. So it's uncertain if that $2.50 is really covering the majority of project costs like it's thought to. On top of this, although these projects are advertised as carbon sequestration methods, the long-term 100-year plus mitigation potential of these projects, as well as their overall net impact, hasn't really been explored. So this study looks at the economic costs and carbon sequestration benefits of FC's 50 million tree program. So to do this, I broke it down into three objectives. The first was to determine the full costs of Forest Canada's projects from seed collection until the free-to-grow stage. The second was to estimate the long-term carbon sequestration potential of these projects 100 years into the future. And then the third was to compare the calculated costs and benefits to evaluate that net impact. To estimate cost, I used project cost data that was provided by Forest Canada for its various projects from January of 2023 to May of 2024. Based on that data provided, I was then able to outline the cost items and stages involved in the entire planting process. And so I ended up with 7 major cost categories, which are these navy blue boxes. There is administrative, stock, shipping and storage, site preparation, planting, tending, and monitoring. Then the mean cost of each cost item or box, which is shown in more detail in this flowchart, could then be calculated as a dollar per tree value. And by summing up the values of each major cost category, again, the navy boxes, I could then arrive at an overall cost of planting, also in dollars per tree. Then lastly, the value of was adjusted to take into account survival rate. And so it redistributed the cost of the trees that don't survive onto the ones that do. And then this dollar per tree value was also converted to a dollar per hectare value to make it comparable to carbon sequestration units. For carbon sequestration, I first calculated gross merchantable volume for each of the 43 species that FC plants in its projects, using the Plonsky normal yield tables. So these are tables that are used to estimate the growth and yield of trees over time. And then I also used an assumption of a 100-year rotation age. So then the IPCC's approach to determining carbon stock within trees was used for each of the 43 species, again, based on the equation on the right. So C is the total carbon in the biomass, V is the merchantable volume from the Plonsky tables, D is the species-specific wood density, BEF is the biomass expansion factor, which converts merchantable volume to above-ground biomass. R is the root to shoot ratio, which considers below ground biomass. And then finally, CF is the species-specific carbon fraction of dry matter, so how much of the biomass is actually composed of carbon. I then converted the amount of carbon to CO2 by multiplying by 3.67, which is the atomic weight ratio of CO2 to carbon, before finally using the area planted under each species to get a weighted average carbon sequestration value across all of FC's projects in tons of CO2 per hectare. Then to convert carbon sequestration from tons of CO2 to a monetary value of dollars per hectare, I used carbon prices based on the social cost of carbon, which represents the economic value of damages avoided by sequestering 1 ton of CO2. So this price accounts for avoided impacts like agricultural productivity losses, property damage from extreme weather events, and negative human health effects. So because these monetary benefits are based on carbon sequestration that occurs 100 years in the future, it's also important to recognize that money has a time value. And so this means that a dollar received today is worth more than a dollar received in the future due to factors like inflation and uncertainty of future benefits. So to account for this, I used the equation here, the net present value equation, which converts future monetary values to their equivalent value today. So here NPV is the net present value, RT is the net benefit or cash flow at time t, I is the discount rate, which reflects the preference society has for benefits today versus the future, and then T is the time in years from now. Finally, to do the cost-benefit analysis, I first wanted to see how different factors could affect the carbon sequestration outcomes. So I conducted an analysis looking at 8 different scenarios based on 3 main factors. The first factor is site class, which is the suitability of a site for growing specific tree species. And I compared how planting in site class 1, optimal planting conditions, differed from planting in more suboptimal conditions, site class 3. The second is the social cost of carbon, which is based on the Government of Canada's estimates for 2080, ranging from $415 per ton of CO2 at the low end and $880 at the high end. And so these values come from 2080 because carbon price estimates for the year of 2124, 100 years into the future, have yet to be calculated. And then the third factor was discount rate. So I looked at differences between a low discount rate for long-term projects at 1% and a high discount rate of 3%. So then once I had those 8 scenarios, I moved on to calculate the cost-benefit ratio by dividing the present value of the benefits by the present value of the costs. And then just to clarify, a cost-benefit ratio of greater than 1 means that the benefits outweigh the costs, and a ratio of less than 1 means that the costs outweigh the benefits. So here is what I found. Before factoring in survival rate, planting costs about $3.97 per tree. But then once you account for how many trees actually survive until they reach the free to grow stage, the cost then goes up to $5.76 per tree, which works out also to be about $1,150 per hectare. If we break that cost down by major cost categories, stock and planting, the 2 categories that are most often looked at when considering tree planting costs, do make up a significant portion at 32% and 25% respectively. But the other categories are also definitely contributing quite a bit to the overall value, covering the remaining 43% of the total costs. For carbon sequestration, under Site Class 1, the 50 million tree program projects will sequester on average about 459 tons of CO2 per hectare in 100 years. In contrast, under Site Class 3, the sequestration potential then drops to 210 tons of CO2 per hectare. And then this graph on the right shows what this looks like over time. So the blue line represents the overall average sequestration on Site Class 1, where you can see there's a slight decrease in the rate of sequestration around age 60, and this likely reflects how tree growth tends to slow down a little bit as they mature. And then the other pale lines are just showing the growth curves in terms of each of the 43 species that we looked at instead of the overall average. One thing that you might notice is that there's no data before age 40, and that is because the yield tables don't allow for the calculation of merchantable volume at those younger ages, but then those ages also don't sequester that much carbon either. And then in terms of site class 3, the orange line, the data for the merchantable volume is also only available for ages 80 and above, and so we can't really look at any changes in terms of rate of sequestration. And then again, the pale orange lines are again for the single individual species. And then in terms of the cost benefit analysis, these are the results of the 8 scenarios that I looked at, as well as a baseline where no discount rate is applied. So the maximum cost benefit ratio for the range of scenarios studied was 129.96, which is the blue box. So essentially the benefits are nearly 130 times the cost. And then the minimum cost benefit ratio of those 8 scenarios is 3.94. So that is the orange box, showing that benefits are still nearly 4 times the cost. So across all the scenarios that I look at, Forest Ontario's planting projects consistently show a positive net impact, with benefits outweighing the cost in every case that we looked at. And then just for reference, prior to any discounting taking place, the benefits range from 76 to about 351 times the cost. So these results show that Forest Canada's funding doesn't fully cover the cost of tree planting. Right now they offer $2.50 per tree, which covers about 63% of the calculated planting cost at $3.97. But if we're looking at the bigger picture, the cost of not just planting the tree, but also making sure that that tree is established on the landscape, that cost then jumps up to $5.76. So at that level of funding only covers 43% of the price. This is important to note because putting the tree into the ground isn't really the end goal. It's about getting those trees to grow and thrive, especially when we're considering benefits like long-term ones like carbon sequestration. So while FC's funding is helping, it doesn't cover enough of the costs to fully support the projects under the 50 million tree program, meaning that there is a potential need to revisit and adjust that funding rate to make sure that the program is better set to match the true cost of tree establishment. However, despite this funding gap, the results of the study suggest that tree planting is still an incredibly cost-effective way to achieve long-term carbon removal from the atmosphere, with the highest return showing that for every dollar spent on tree planting, society gets back nearly $130 in value through carbon sequestration. And then even in the scenario with the lowest return, society still receives nearly 4 times its investment. So if Forest Canada does decide to increase its funding, this analysis makes a strong case for NRCan to keep covering that 50% of the funding, even at a higher rate, or possibly even covering more than 50% of the funding. And then these numbers are also a powerful way to attract private donors and companies looking to support climate positive projects. So these findings can also help with the other 50% of the funding. So to end it off with some future directions, these are a few ways that the findings could be further built on. The first is, instead of grouping species under the 6 Plonsky yield tables, future research could find and develop species-specific growth yield tables for each of the 43 species that were used. So this could improve the precision of the carbon sequestration estimates. The second is a wider range of scenarios could be examined. So instead of just looking at the social cost of carbon, we could also look at voluntary market carbon prices. And so that would provide assessments of potential revenue and monetizable outcomes. And then lastly, future research could also go a step further and not just discount the monetary value, but also carbon sequestration itself. So the idea that carbon captured today might be more valuable than carbon captured sometime in the future. And yeah, that brings me to the end of my presentation. I'd like to say a quick thank you to my internal supervisor, Rasoul, and my external supervisor, Jess, who helped me throughout this capstone, as well as the many members of the restoration and stewardship team at Forest Canada, who were invaluable and very helpful during my internship. And of course, the 2023 and 24 MFC cohort who got through this crazy program with me. So thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, I'll pass the mic to Jessica.
Great job, Grace. My first question is, what did you find were some of the greatest limitations to doing some of the financial analysis with our data? And if you would have any recommendations related to some of our data, whether it's our systems or our collection?
Yeah, I think so. The biggest challenge when I was doing the data for the cost is that the costs are reported very inconsistently. So different groups, planting partners will report prices with different names. They will report it in different units. And so getting that onto the same page could be very helpful to better calculate costs and keep it consistent across like different projects.
Now that we're going more outside of Ontario, I'm curious what you think or how do you think the information would change as we look at planting in other provinces? So what are some of the variables that we'll need to consider as we look at other areas of the country?
Mhm. So I think there's going to be a lot of differences in terms of like your forest regions. So species composition is a big thing. If we're looking at southern versus northern regions, even within the same species, there are differences in growth rate. And then also I think something that could really alter the results is when we're considering the frequency of natural disturbances. So if we're thinking in the north, even if you're planting the same species in the same amount, the likelihood of being exposed to things like wildfire that could then alter the amount of survival and therefore carbon sequestration in the north versus the south could be very different.
Last question for me is you kind of touched on it near the end with a few slides, but if you were to summarize your research into like a headline, so a headline for a newspaper, what's the headline?
Let's see. If we wanted something really catchy, it could be like tree planting is over 100 times, like the benefit is over 100 times the cost or something like that. Just something short and catchy.
Is it working? Yes. Hi, Grace. Thank you very much for the great presentation. Having some economic in your presentation, I must check that as well with some questions. So you have used the formula for net present value for the carbon monetary values, and you have used some decision factors like interest rate and carbon price in your scenario analysis. So the fact is that, as you have mentioned, a lot of these plantations are happening also in the private land. And the factors that we have used in this formula, sometimes they are social factors, or they are defined by the society, how much they value carbon and interest rate. If you think that this idea of carbon value is private value, how these values will change and how you would try to define them.
So I think I'll touch on it very briefly on my future benefit slide. So when we're saying expanded scenarios like voluntary markets, so even though in this case, we're using the social costs of carbon, but again, we can use the voluntary carbon market in terms of private landowners and if they want to monetize that. Yeah, sorry, I think I forgot the rest of your question.
Another question is back there, discounting and discount factor, which is very difficult for the private landowners and agreements. And that's the question that nobody can answer, but I wanted to hear from you as well, how you would define, like if it's a private agreement and it is a voluntary market, what interest rate will you use, or how you would try to define it for the private landowner?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to get like a specific value in terms of private land. I think to me, because it's so uncertain, what makes the most sense is to just look at a range of values. So maybe not just looking at 1% and 3%, but like a range of possibilities and see how that impacts the results.
Okay. You can also simply ask what is their personal discount factor. That helps us. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe, okay, yeah, a question from the audience.
Hi, Grace. Great
Hi.
presentation. I have a question. It's maybe more like a fun one, but if a landowner came up to you, like you were there planting, and they said, I want to maximize my CO2 carbon sequestration, what would you kind of recommend the landowners to look for in their plantings?
So I think of the species that I looked at, some of the ones that had the maximum amount of sequestration were things like red pine or I think maybe white cedar and white pine as well. But I think an important thing to mention was that the benefits aren't just for carbon sequestration. There's also a lot of benefits in terms of biodiversity, habitat, of a lot of other other benefits. And so maybe highlighting the point that yes, carbon is a great thing, but also consider all these other factors as well.
Wonderful presentation, Grace, very informative. So you mentioned that the highest percentage cost was, I think, stock and planting. So you had access to a range of data, I assume. Do you have any insight as to sort of the lower cost delivery? And did you gain any insight into maybe how others could benefit from what they're doing? I'm not sure whether stock would have too much variability, but planting potentially. But I'm looking for your input.
Yeah, I think during my internship, we looked at differences in terms of region, of places in Ontario, so northern versus central versus southern. And so we saw that there's some differences in price in terms of that. But I think those are mainly due to things like labor cost differences or material cost differences. And so I don't know that there would necessarily be a clear, at least through what I've seen, a clear recommendation of how to maybe reduce costs in a certain region versus another or anything like that.
Fair enough. And one other question. Do you include any cost or carbon footprint for the cost of monitoring, and how long would the monitoring go on for?
Yeah, so that's not something that is considered in this study, but I think that's definitely something important for future studies. So any carbon emissions that are generated through the planting, transporting, monitoring, of course, I think are definitely important things to consider in the future. Yeah.
So your discount rates are low.
Mhm.
I just asked ChatGPT, what the, usual discount rates would be, and 1 to 3% is low. And that's my experience too for, development projects and so forth. You would really oftentimes see, 3 to 5% as a moderate, but oftentimes higher discount rates. And, result that goes back to the inception of the concept of net present value is that discount rates of, forestry investments in forestry look really good if you've got, discount rates that are say 1.5% or something, but not so good if you have discount rates that are appreciably higher. So that's number one. And number two, there's in addition to the disturbance issue that you mentioned, which is important, there's a lack of soil processes and non CO2 greenhouse gas fluxes. And so I wonder how those would affect the analyses.
Just one thing I wanted to say. So in terms of the discount rates for being low, these are the ones that were sort of suggested in terms of the IPCC for long-term projects. And so those are the ones that I wanted to base it off of. But maybe you're also correct that like it's worth looking at for like higher discount rates as well.
And non-CO2 greenhouse gases in soil.
Sorry,
You left out the soil and.
Sorry, I was too focused on the discount rate. Could you repeat that?
Yes.
Yeah.
So soil, how would, there's no soil carbon sequestration, and there's no non-greenhouse and non-CO2 greenhouse gas flux incorporated in the analysis. So that I wonder how that would affect things.
Yeah, I think if we're considering soil carbon as well, that may increase the amount of sequestration that's happening. And then in terms of other greenhouse gases, I'm not quite sure about that. Yeah.
We have a couple of questions from online. Number one from Carrie Ann. Did you account for any leakage due to land use change or natural disturbance?
So these are under the assumption that the planted area will stay planted. And so there's no guarantee that if you're doing the project for tree planting that it will continue to be a forest 100 years in the future. So that's not really accounted for because we're not really certain if that will be the case or not. So this is sort of a best case scenario of that.
And from William, he says, great presentation and research. Could you clarify what tree planting density you use for calculations? On one of the earlier slides, you had a tree planting value of $3.97 to $5.76, considering survival rates, but a per hectare cost of 1,149. From his understanding of those numbers, the per hectare planting density would work out quite low.
So these are the per hectare values in terms of how many trees would be left at the end. And so because of that, the number of stems is quite low by the end of it, because you have things like natural losses and as well, like from competition and self-thinning and things like that.
To follow up on that, I have a question. When you say at the end, do you mean like at the 40-year mark when the carbon valuation starts, or like at the
by
end of the 100 years? Okay.
Yeah.
Is there another online question or? Okay. Great. Thank
you.
you so much. Excellent.